Hi, my name is Olaf Alders, and I am here to talk to you a little bit about the MetaCPAN API today. Just by a show of hands, how many people here use MetaCPAN as their default search site? Okay, that's good. That's good. And how many people have tried to build anything with the MetaCPAN API? Okay, so that's good. So we got a good mix there. So I was kind of struggling with how to present the information today. There really is sort of a lot, but I didn't really want to bombard you with a lot of code samples. What I really want to do today more is talk about sort of the underlying structure of MetaCPAN so that you just will be better able to understand how to get what you need from it. And I'm also trying to figure out how Keynote works. So when we get to the code samples, it's just let me know if the resolution's okay. So the architecture of MetaCPAN is essentially that it's built on Elasticsearch, and it uses Catalyst as a thin wrapper around Elasticsearch. Is anyone here who's used Elasticsearch before directly? Okay, great. So the reason we chose Elasticsearch was there actually wasn't really a lot of thought behind it. I had been talking about building some kind of an API to get information about CPAN modules. Somebody suggested Elasticsearch, and it seemed like a good fit. I was just kind of doing this as something for myself, and I wasn't sure if anybody else was going to use it, so I didn't put too much thought into it. But it actually turns out that Elasticsearch was a really great choice. It makes full text searching easy. One other reason that we used it was that it comes with an API right out of the box, so you don't have to have arguments with people about what endpoints should look like. And it's also quite fast, and you can literally index millions of documents and still get a lot of speed from it. So that's essentially how it works. You need to be aware that Elasticsearch is underneath for when you start to do things that are a little more complicated. We've tried to make the easy things easy, but the complicated things, we sort of try to make them less complicated. But you will need to know a little bit about Elasticsearch if you want to get to that point. There's still really a lot that you can do without even caring about Elasticsearch, and we'll talk about that. So basically, we'll start with a rough introduction to the API, and then we'll talk about some things to be aware of when using Elasticsearch, and those are things that you can take with you to other projects where you might want to use something like Elasticsearch. So, and now actually by show of hands, who has worked with sort of NoSQL data stores in the past? Okay, great. This was the first time I had worked with anything like this, and it is helpful to think of it in terms of sort of relational database. Elasticsearch, we don't talk about it having databases, we talk about having an index or indices, and I don't talk about tables, we talk about types, but you're probably okay if you just sort of equate those things in your mind. When you hear index, think database. When you hear type, think table, and that'll actually get you pretty far. Now, what we've done with MetaCPAN is we have various types where we store the data, so various tables, and we've exposed an endpoint of the API for each of these types. So essentially, if you want to get information about an author, you go to /author. If you want to get information about a release, you go to /release. Distribution, you go to /distribution. That's all sort of fairly straightforward stuff. But I did want to talk a bit about how we structure the data. And what's sort of important about this is that we've sort of had to impose a little bit of our own structure onto CPAN, because CPAN doesn't really care about some of these things. CPAN essentially cares about files that you upload to it. It doesn't necessarily have like a concept of a release or a distribution like that. So basically, if you think of it in relational terms, you have an author at the top. An author has many distributions. A distribution has many releases. A release has many modules. And a module might have pod. So essentially, you can think of every upload of Moose as sort of the distribution. Moose exists as this distribution. And every time version 1 or version 2 gets released, that's a new release in that distribution. And then that release will contain modules, and some of the modules will have pod. I mean, there's more to it than that. But this is sort of a nice way to abstract that stuff. I mean, we know that a distribution contains more than just modules, or at least does. There's README files and changes and all that sort of thing. But a lot of that stuff isn't really that important for this. And then to that, we should add that a distribution can have favorites, and a distribution can also have ratings. And so the ratings are just the ratings that we've poached from CPAN ratings. There's, I think, a CSV that gets updated once a day, and we sort of take some data from that. And then the favorites are every time you click on the plus button on MetaCPAN. And so we've sort of, you can sort of attach those to the distribution level. That's all you really need to know. When you click on the plus, there's a data point that gets entered into the favorite type. When you click on plus for the same distribution again, it gets removed. So that's actually one important thing to recognize about MetaCPAN, is that a lot of times when you click on plus, you think you're actually favoriting that module, but you're actually favoriting the distribution that module belongs to. And this could become problematic if you favorited something, a module in a distribution that then gets broken out and moved into its own distribution. So that's sort of a design decision that we're a little bit stuck with right now, but it mostly works.
I find that it's also problematic with some distributions that can be piecemeal and are intended to be kind of a set of utilities or whatever that you can grab. And yeah, it would be really great to be able to allow the author to say, when people favorite my distribution, we favorite the distribution, or when they favorite their favorite modules, because the authors will know, which is which.
Yeah, that's actually a real problem. Like I say, if you go to there's like a Mojo user agent that's part of Mojolicious, but it's really not the same thing when you think about it. So if you're favoriting one, you're actually favoriting the whole thing. And even if you're favoriting something that's core in Perl, you're actually just favoriting Perl itself, which is fine, but it's not really the same thing. And we all know that stuff does get removed from core. We are actually working on having a system of tagging. And then there was a big discussion about tagging. Do we want to actually tag the modules themselves, or do we want to tag the distributions? And we have come down in favor of tagging the modules rather than the distributions. So it's probably not unlikely that we can sort of move that decision over to the favorites as well and try and clear that up a little bit. So when you're calling MetaCPAN, this is the base URL that you'll call. You can use SSL, but most of the endpoints you don't need to. We've implemented sort of this primitive form of versioning where you just put a v0 at the beginning. If you leave the v0 off, you won't get punished for it, but you might get punished down the line when the versioning changes. So it's just a good thing to keep in mind. We don't have really plans at this point to change the versioning, but we just did want to leave that option for future. I mean, the first year or so, this was all very flexible, so it was sort of use it at your own risk, but now it's definitely a lot more stable. Things aren't changing that much. We are adding new endpoints and stuff, but so as far as endpoints go, we have two different kinds of endpoints, and this is actually an important distinction to make. We've got the convenience endpoints, and we've got the Elasticsearch endpoints, and there's a little bit of overlap between these endpoints. So the way you can think of it is that every type, so every table, has a corresponding endpoint. You've got the author, you've got the release, you've got distribution, you've got favorites, this sort of thing. But not every endpoint has a corresponding type. And we'll get to that in a minute. So we'll start with the convenience endpoints. Elasticsearch does have an API that you can get requests from. It doesn't look quite like this, though. Well, it actually, in some cases it does. But what we've done here is we've abstracted away some of the stuff that needs to happen underneath. So if you go to /author/doi, it's really saying to Elasticsearch, get me the author record that has this ID. Everything needs to have a unique ID. We've done the same thing for distribution, release, module, pod. And then we've got a couple of, let me just say that there actually is no module type, and we'll get to that, and there is no pod type. And the reason that there's no pod type is that, pod is just something that you get from another document, like from a module. So when you hit the pod endpoint, we're actually just saying, oh, what's the module you care about? Where do we find that file in the distribution? Then we may need to actually untar the distribution, extract the pod, and then we'll serve it up to you. But essentially, we don't need to duplicate all this data into extra types. We've just recently added this autocomplete type, which for people working on web apps and stuff might be sort of particularly interesting, like TRS over here, and we'll show an example of that as well. Especially if you're doing something Ajaxy and you want to put in an autocomplete, this essentially gives you pretty much what you need out of the box. And then we've got a reverse dependencies endpoint. So reverse dependencies would be show me all the modules that rely on Moose. Now, these convenience endpoints can get a little more complex if you want. So we do have some of these that you can actually supply versioning information to. Because if you go back to these ones, you'll see, oh, when I say module Moose, what am I actually going to get? Well, you're going to get the latest version of Moose and also the latest authorized version. So it's important to understand that anybody essentially could upload a moose.pm, but only one of those, hopefully, would be the latest authorized version. So again, you can sort of upload tons of stuff to CPAN if you want, but it doesn't necessarily make that an authorized distribution. For that to be authorized, you have to be have like a maintenance or a co-maintenance permission on the module. So in these cases, usually when you say module Moose, that's essentially what you mean. Just show me the latest version. That's what I care about today. But there may be cases where you want to see the documentation for a few versions back, especially if you're working with an older version or you want to see where some kind of incompatibility came up. So in that case, you would just use these versioned URLs. And, you know, they essentially sort of basically follow the same patterns. Now, some of these convenience URLs don't expose Elasticsearch's DSL because they don't have to. So, for example, for the pod, just because it is a special case, you can just get it. You don't need to do any kind of a complex JSON request or anything like that. And also don't expect JSON in return. We're actually just going to give you the raw document. If we wanted to, and I think initially we did wrap the pod in JSON, but it's essentially pointless because you just have to decode the data and then just extract the field that you want. So this is just one of those things where we want to make things easy for you. And in fact, if you want right now, you could just go to a web browser and type in api.metacpan.org/v0/pod moose or whatever, and it'll just get you the pod like that. Now it defaults to HTML, but that's not the only thing you're stuck with. If you want, you can pass it a content type in the query parameter, and you can just tell it that you want text HTML, text plain. We've got an XPod if you actually just want the raw pod. And then we've got Markdown as well. We're open to adding more formats if people need them. That's certainly not a problem. The other way you can do that is by sending a content type header. Whichever way you want to do that is up to you. One easy way you can do it is by using the MetaCPAN API module, which this is the first mention of that. But MetaCPAN API is actually a good starting point to get started because it'll just handle the user agent making the requests and all that stuff for you. It's really easy to get what you need without having to write a lot of code or really to worry about how this stuff works. And so it's actually important to note that this content type parameter is actually not in the documentation. I realized that this week, so that's definitely something we need to get fixed up. There's some plans as well to beef up the MetaCPAN API module so that we can point that out as a good starting point for people. And one use of the pod is the perlybook.org, which allows you to create EPUB or Mobi out of CPAN documentation. So, and then we get to the autocomplete endpoint. And autocomplete basically, I think, pretty much works like you would expect it to. Just give it a query parameter. You can give it a partial module name. You can include the colons and everything in that. Don't send any JSON in, but do expect to get JSON out for this endpoint. So our TRS over here is actually this is probably one of the most useful implementations of the autocomplete. Is making rt.cpan actually a lot easier to use just with with that one feature. This one here is actually kind of neat too. If you use Alfred on your Mac, then you've got this sort of built-in workflow. I don't actually use Alfred, but actually makes me think maybe I should start. So let's get on to the real endpoints then. For example, we've got author, distribution, favorite, file, with the rating and the release. Does anyone have any questions about those endpoints? Okay. So here's a question: why is module missing? Well, module is actually kind of a file, so again, it doesn't need its own endpoint. But the problem with module is that there's enough logic that goes on behind the scenes to figure out which kind of a file is a module that we just abstracted that away for you. This is the kind of request you're going to make all the time, so there's no point in you having to go through a lot of logic to get it. So just realize that a module is a file. So if you're sort of digging around a little bit deeper into Elasticsearch, it can actually get a little bit confusing. Okay, and then we've also got one special endpoint, which is the user endpoint. Now, you need to be logged in to be able to get anything useful out of this, and you need to use the SSL here. And essentially, this is what MetaCPAN.org, the search site, uses to identify you. And there's a special token in there, and you can use that token if you want to, say, write a command line application that will add favorites, things like that. So that's how we can identify you. So the inconvenient part about this is that you actually have to physically go to this URL and then find the token and copy paste it. Once you've done that hard work, then you're okay. And I believe that the token's fairly static, so you don't need to worry about that. You just don't want to expose it to your friends, I guess. So now when we get down to exploring the endpoints, as I was preparing this talk, I did actually realize that the documentation is kind of weak. I know that Sterling gave a talk on his Android app last year, and he spent a good chunk of the talk saying how bad the documentation was. And a year later, it's maybe not that much better. You do have to dig around a bit. One of the points of this talk is for me to teach you where to look, what you need to do to find stuff, because a lot of this stuff is self-documenting to an extent, but when you come to it, you're just like, what is going on here? So we do have a lot of people coming to the IRC channel just kind of trying to find their way around, and that's fine too. But we do have some tools to help you figure out exactly what's going on. And the first interesting one is MetaCPAN Explorer. And this is basically a way to expose the API to you so that you can just enter basic requests. Like up here in the request box, you could just do, say, a GET request, and then the response will show up in the box below, just sort of the raw JSON that you would get in return. Now you can also do posts as well, so you can put your post parameters in the body that's that larger text box under the request. And then just on the left-hand side, just click on any of those to get an example of how it works. And this actually is a really good way to explore the API and sort of figure out what's going on. I should also add that, say, when you get the author endpoint there, you'll see that it's just sort of relevant JSON that gets returned. That's a convenience endpoint that removes a lot of the Elasticsearch sort of debugging information that comes along with the request. When you get a request from Elasticsearch, it'll actually tell you information about, say, which shards it's using, how many total results you have, how long the request took. And for a lot of our purposes, we don't really care about that stuff, so that's why the convenience endpoints extract that from you. And it also removes a bunch of layers that you have to go through in the that are nested inside the object to try and get the data that you want. So that's one thing to be aware of too, because you might go to a different endpoint and get output that looks completely different, and then you're sort of wondering why that is. Now, the thing about MetaCPAN Explorer that's kind of neat is we've integrated it with the search site as well. And so you see right down here at the bottom, there's the yellow arrow that points to the MetaCPAN Explorer link. And when you're clicking around MetaCPAN, we've added that link to most of the pages, not necessarily to the search pages, but to the author, the module, the release, and that sort of thing. And then if you click on that, that will actually show you the data that we use to generate that page. So it's helpful when you see something that's on the page that you don't understand, but it's also helpful to say, if you don't want to craft the URL yourself, you can say, if you want to find out about a specific author, just go to that author's page and then go to the Explorer page, and then you'll get some information about that person. As an aside, the little profile widgets that you see there, those appear once you've logged in and you've added those URLs to your profile. But those all appear also in the JSON output for the author. So it's actually not that hard to craft a query that says, give me all the CPAN authors that use Twitter, and then you could sort of use that to create your own CPAN authors Twitter list or something like that. So that kind of stuff is neat. One of the examples last year we talked about was just show me all the CPAN authors who are on GitHub and have the hireable flag set to yes. Yep.
Is there privacy? You have to be logged in to get that information in the first place?
That's exposed. So there's nothing that's really private in that sort of profile information, but there is the user endpoint that's got more, say, that shows which accounts, like your pause account, all the stuff that you've attached to that account. I mean, we try to, I think that stuff is all fairly secure. So, but it was the whole point of this really to start with was we just wanted to be able to know more about people. So we wanted to expose as much data as possible. And there are some people that get a little bit irked when they find out that their plus data is exposed to everyone else. But you just do need to realize that unless it's a password or something like that, you're just putting it out for everyone. when we first got started, I had no idea what we'd want to put in the author endpoint, so we just left a freeform section in it and said, like, just put in whatever you want. People were putting in the names of their cats and their dogs and all sorts of stuff, which is good. You could still do that. And on the author page, there's still a freeform section at the bottom. And you could put in a haiku, anything you want about yourself, and it'll get served up by the API. And the reason we did that was just to see what people would put in it, so that we would know sort of what to standardize on. And people had lots of great ideas, and that's actually sort of where a lot of this profile stuff comes from. One thing is also you could put in the name of your Nikon IRC as well to make it a little bit easier. And that's one thing people probably don't realize is you can search on an IRC nick. If you just type that in on metacpan.org, then it will show the relevant author. Also, yeah, if it's sort of it'll show up like as one of the author icons that come up near the top. So that's sort of a neat thing. I would like to see some tighter integration for that, where you could just show a channel on irc.perl and actually show like who these people are that are in the channel, just because it's good. You want?
Yeah. Do I need to create an account on CPAN first before creating one on MetaCPAN?
No, you don't. But if you want to have an author page, then you need to be an author. So you need to have your POS ID, and that's been sort of a point of contention, because then initially you had to have a POS ID to be able to ++, and then people were requesting POS ID specifically just to ++, and then the POS admins didn't want the extra overhead, so we've removed that requirement. But the problem now is that you might have interesting information like on your profile or ++, but we don't actually have an endpoint to expose that to people. I think what we'll probably end up doing is adding, say, like a user endpoint, so that if you're a user but not an author, that you have some kind of a homepage. Because I mean, initially we thought, like say the ++, we want to get feedback from people who are authors because they may know best about what's quality software, what isn't. But I don't know that it's always necessarily the case. I'm sure there are people that haven't authored things on CPAN that still, have a clue. So that's something that we need to think about. But it was sort of like we just wanted to do, just sort of cover the most popular use cases to start with. So now the other way to explore this is by exploring the mapping. So say I want to find out what kind of information will the author endpoint give me. I can look at the mapping. Now the mapping is sort of analogous to like a show create table on SQL. And this will tell you, so it won't actually give you any results, but it'll tell you what's in the field. If you don't know a lot about Elasticsearch, you don't have to worry too much about this stuff, but it will actually give you, say, the names of fields. And I mean, they're sort of enough to get you started here. And using this in tandem with actual author results can actually be quite helpful. And then for those of you who, once you get a little more familiar with Elasticsearch, you'll find the mappings to be quite helpful. So if you ever have a question about an endpoint, going to _mapping is a great place to start. Now, another good place to start is just going to _search. And _search would be analogous to saying, select star limit 10, because that's what it'll do. It'll just give you the first 10 results. And that again, so in combination with the mapping is quite good to have. And then you'll see here, so example under the profile, that those are just sort of like nested objects that appear. You get a hash of array refs back for that, just with name and ID as the keys. That kind of stuff's quite easy to use. And then you also see you get handy things like we'll give you an author's gravatar URL. The one problem with the gravatar URL is we can't actually tell if there's a real gravatar behind it. It might just be one of those, whatever ones that they make up. You actually haven't uploaded your photo or you don't. You could still, if you haven't uploaded anything to gravatar, you still will get some sort of an auto-generated thing like that. So if you were going to create a map of CPAN, like author faces, you'd get a lot of garbage in it that way. But that's just the way the gravatar works. If you're really desperate, you can look at the API code, and it's basically Moose, and you can check out the Moose attributes that are in place for all of the different fields in the type. So again, fields are a term we haven't dealt with, but you can think of a field as a column. So a type would be a table, and a field would be a column on that table. There's also some good habits that you want to get into. Things that'll make your life easier. You can enable compression. If you're going to be crafting your own queries, just make sure you send an accept header for gzip content, and then for really large queries, that'll be good for you. It'll be good for us too. So one thing we want to do is we want you to use this resource as much as possible. We want to definitely make sure that other people can use it too. And because the search site is a layer on top of the API, we need to make sure that the API is fast. It is, the entire index is actually in RAM, so it is quite fast, but our resources are not unlimited. When you actually get down to crafting your Elasticsearch queries, some of the examples show you get examples because they're easy to show. And people want to start doing more complicated things, and they want to squeeze everything into a get, and it just becomes a nightmare at some point trying to nest all this information. So my advice to you is essentially don't bother. If you want to say use something like the convenience endpoint and pass, say you want to pass, obviously, say the query parameter to the autocomplete endpoint, things like that, that makes sense. But if you're going to start adding filters and things like that, don't do it in a get, because you're just going to make your own life complicated. And then actually putting it out in a post, it just visually makes it a lot clearer, and I think it's actually a good way to go. Now, there is a limit on requests. Initially, there was no limit on requests, but you can probably guess why we have one now. So we have an upper limit of 5,000, and so if you need more data points, you just use something called the scrolling API. And what the scrolling API actually does is the first request, you'll tell it what you need, and you will give it the number of minutes you want this sort of scroll to keep alive between requests. So essentially you're saying, just calculate all this data for me and give me an ID back so I can fetch it. And then the next request will get the ID, and then you will just keep following it. It's sort of an iterator. Think of it that way. The good part is you don't need to worry about any of this stuff. If you just use the Elasticsearch .pm module, it abstracts all this stuff away from you, and I'll show you a code sample for that in a bit. But essentially, just be aware that if you want more than 5,000 things, you need to scroll. Now, just also be aware that if you're scrolling, you're getting everything anyway, so don't expect it in the order that you want it. Just because there are resources involved with sorting things. So just realize, like, if you're going to get, let's say, every distribution, which would be in the 70,000s or something like that, just get it all if you need it sorted, and then sort it on your own afterwards. And we don't have a problem with you grabbing 70,000 records. Like, obviously get what you need, because there are enough resources to get it to you this way. Now, for those of you that know a little bit about Elasticsearch, you can, when you do something that's a little more complicated, you can use a query or you can use a filter. Generally, you want to use a filter. You would use the query when you want to have some kind of relevance to your results. Like, say the front page of MetaCPAN.org is a good example, because you want to have relevant results, right? You type in plaque, you don't want plaque middleware to come up first, you want plaque. And so Elasticsearch can search various fields and aggregate everything and assign a score to things, and that's when you want to use a query. But for most stuff, you don't need it. Like, say if you're going to get all the distributions in CPAN, you don't need those sorted by any kind of relevance. So you just grab everything. So essentially, if in doubt, just use a filter. If you need to use a query, then you'll know it. And the good thing about this is that filters will use considerably less resources because they don't need to perform the scoring. So that will get you faster results, and it keeps the API faster for people as well. Okay, so we want to fetch some data. Now I've got a repository of examples now. If anybody, like, once you get started, you can just clone this repository, use this carton, so you can just, there's some instructions in the README. It'll just install the modules for you quickly, and then you can get up and running really within a few minutes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, does anybody know how I can actually just get out of Keynote while I'm in the presenter mode?
Escape.
Just escape? Nice, okay. So let me try, it's not mirrored is the problem. Let me see if I can.
You can change that up on the display.
No. Oh yeah, I do, or no I don't. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to.
Display is control panel.
Yeah, I can't even get to my control panel right now. Let me just, I'm just going to just do this and just set my displays to mirror. Sorry. I should have, coming here, I realized I should have practiced this with 2 monitors because I just had no clue. Ryla.
It's on the,
You've got a modal on the, it's not very.
Okay, you know what? Can you guys actually, is that legible, the examples there?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's do it this way. Okay. Okay, so actually I'll just show you what this repo looks like. Oops. And essentially I've tried to organize all these things sort of by topic, or sorry, rather by endpoint. And so you've got, and I've also got them numbered so that if you were trying to work through the endpoints, you could start at the bottom and work your way to the top as the queries get a little more complicated. And if you are getting started, I would definitely recommend you start with the author endpoint because those will be sort of the most basic examples that are in there. Now I've got just a few that I had selected for today. So the cool thing about the API is that you can do stuff in a sort of many ways. We'll start with there. That's sort of the easiest way to fetch something. And again, that's just using curl. The cool thing about using curl is that if you're trying to troubleshoot a query, you can just gist it, and then anybody can run it without having to care about all the underlying code that goes with it. So let's go to 2. Now this would actually be using the MetaCPAN API module, and again, this is just a few more lines of code, but it's really not a lot just to get an author. It's sort of fairly trivial stuff. Just use the module, instantiate an object, and then pass the author name. That's all I need to do there. Now, using the Elasticsearch module, there again is a little bit more code involved, but it's still not a lot of huge overhead. Now, the important thing to see here is that there's a no refresh parameter you need to pass to it. Basically, you're going to get a really hard to debug error if you don't do that. It'll try to contact an endpoint that's not exposed. Basically, you can have more than one node on your Elasticsearch cluster, and if you don't set that to 1, it'll try and figure out what all the nodes are. We only have 1 node, so it's not really something that's important for us. And then this trace calls standard out I found is quite helpful because it'll just tell you everything that's going on. So let me just see if we can actually run this. Okay, so here you go. You see that so at the very top, what Elasticsearch does is it shows you what the actual GET request was. You'll notice that it actually uses localhost here rather than the server. You'll have to sort of copy and paste that in if you want to try this at the command line yourself. That's just like a feature of the Elasticsearch module. I'm trying to get that changed, and that may get changed in a later version. But essentially, it shows you the entire request. The pretty equals 1 means that the JSON output you get will actually be readable. And then you can see the raw response that we got, and then I've just dumped the actual hashref that we've got, which is essentially the same thing. So just going back to that, you can see there's not really a lot involved with getting this. Another tip here is that we talked about the index and how the index is equivalent sort of to a database name. In this case, you always have to pass an index of version 0. That's a bit of a hack on our part. But the cool part about this is that when the version bumps up, you can just bump up that number there. We've only got 1 database one index that we're using anyway, so that's sort of information that's not relevant anyway. So essentially, just remember to pass an index of v0 because that's sort of a weird. If you don't do that, you're going to get some bugs that may be hard to debug. And then. And this is an example of a scrolled search now, and this is what I was talking about, getting the iterator. So again, there's a little bit more code here, but it's really not so bad. And a lot of this stuff you could probably just abstract away into a module. So you want to set the search type to scan. Let's start at the top here, actually. This is the queries I'm talking about. We're actually not using a query here, but we do need to tell it. We just sort of need to send it an empty query, and that's how we don't use the query. Later versions of Elasticsearch, you don't need to use that, but we haven't upgraded yet on our end. So basically, you just send it this match all query, and that's like a select star. You can think of that. Search type is scan. then you're going to give it the amount of time you want between keep alive, or sort of between requests when you do the scrolling. So in this case, it's saying just keep this all for 5 minutes. If you don't hear from me in 5 minutes, you can uncache it. Then again, the index, the type, and the size. So I've for the purpose of this example, I've set a very small size, but there's no reason you can't ask for 100 or 5,000 authors at once. It all depends on your purposes. And then essentially you just get this iterator, and then you can do what you want. Once you've consumed your first 100 objects, the Elasticsearch will fetch the next batch in the background. You don't have to worry about it at all. Yeah.
Not to jump ahead, I don't know if you're going to cover Sawyer's module.
Well, that was MetaCPAN API. We just covered it a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right.
Did you have any questions about that in particular?
No. It just seems I hadn't used the Elasticsearch.
Yeah.
Directly,
So last year when I talked about this, I did tell people to use Sawyer's module, but the problem with Sawyer's module is just that there are endpoints that haven't been added to it yet, and also it sometimes makes it a little more difficult to do some of the complex queries. And I've spoken with him, and there's a lot of that's going to be totally reworked. So we'll eventually just tell people to use that. But in the meantime, just use Elasticsearch. And so it'll be a little more verbose, but it'll get you what you want. There's like a search builder in Elasticsearch that makes these queries even less verbose. But I haven't used that here because what you see there won't correspond to what you see in the Elasticsearch docs and things like that. So I just want to keep everything quite clear. I think we're almost out of time here, right? Does anybody have any questions? Yeah?
This may be slightly less specific to MetaCPAN, I guess, but so the whole ES indexes in RAM. If that were not the case, would the trade-off between a match-all query and then filtered results be less of an obvious win? Is that match-all query not expensive because everything's already in RAM and resident?
No, and I should actually say that I'm not an Elasticsearch expert at all. The good thing about it is that you don't need to be either to actually be getting anything useful out of this. But the way I understand it is that the match-all query just says don't do any scoring, and it's the actual scoring that's expensive.
Okay.
Because you're going to have to go through all the documents anyway. There's always going to be that overhead, but there's no score. There's not like scoring and sorting and stuff like that, right? Because there's sort of a lot of stuff. And then I think with the filter, there is some advantage of some caching going on in the background as well. And this is just an example of how you might use the autocomplete endpoint. In this case, I've used mechanized gzip because it'll just add that accept header. That's essentially all this module does. It just subclasses mechanized and adds that one header. Which it would be nice actually if mechanized just had that built in. And then you can see you can just sort of pass a partial search term and it'll give you something useful. So let's just go back to Keynote here. I'm just gonna go through this way. So I know I've given you a lot of information to work with here. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, feel free to contact me in person here or by email, or especially on IRC. It's MetaCPAN on irc.perl.org. And there's generally 24 hours a day somebody there who's willing to help you. It's very helpful. It's very, it's actually very, very sort of positive community. There aren't. MetaCPAN is a little bit different than some channels where you almost never find somebody being rude to anybody else. It's sort of. We just kind of want to make it a place where you can ask the stupidest question you can think of, and nobody's going to laugh at you, because essentially when we started with this, we were all asking really stupid questions. This sort of begs the discussion about whether there is such a thing as a stupid question. But essentially ask what you want. You won't be judged. You will not be judged. You particularly won't be judged by me, because there's a lot about this that I don't understand. So now, if you actually want to hack on MetaCPAN itself, I just want to put in a quick plug for this. It actually was sort of not always that easy to get started. A lot of dependencies and things to install, but Leo Lapworth has done a lot of work, and we now have a pre-configured VM that you can just download. So as long as you've got VirtualBox and Vagrant installed, and we've got instructions for you how to do that, you can just download this virtual machine, get it started, and then you will have port forwarding set up so that you can access your own API and your own search site. So you can do all this stuff in self-contained environment. You could be on an airplane, in the subway, working on this. it's all, yeah.
Point to your own CPAN MIDI, and where's that
Yep.
data?
Well, there's a script then that comes with it that you can download a CPAN mini, or you can download the entire CPAN, or you can get CPAN plus backpan, I guess, if you wanted to, or you can even just get a fragment of a CPAN and index that. So, I mean, it takes a long time to index the whole thing, so essentially you might want to start with, say, your author directory, just index everything in that, and then you'll get sort of useful search results to start with. But the cool thing about this is if you, for some reason, wanted to have your own sort of dark pan at your company, you could essentially grab this VM, get CPAN modules, get your own modules on it, maybe your own StrataPan or whatever, and then index that. So you'd have your own CPAN that you could use, but you'd also have your own search site where you could search just the versions of the documentation that you have. So that's kind of a neat... Okay, now, and just in closing, before you go live in production, rule number 1 is to be polite. And be polite is pretty much what you think it means. It's just try not to be too crazy. And we'll leave that entirely up to you. Rule number 2 is that there is no rule number 2, just be polite. So there's been, I can only think of maybe 2 cases where we had to shut somebody down. And it was only because we couldn't contact them. And everybody was well-intentioned. It's just, yeah, sometimes you do crazy stuff, you don't realize it. So, I mean, it's just, if you're going to don't try not to do like 50 requests a second or something like that. You know, you can space these things out. And the other thing is to please identify yourself. There is an API consumers page on the wiki. It's not mandatory, but if you put your information in there, what you'll do is set your own custom user agent for your application, and then give us some contact information. And then if we see stuff cluttering the logs that shouldn't be there, we can contact you before we necessarily have to shut you down. Yeah, so we've got a resources page, and just get on RSC and talk to us if you have any questions. Yeah.
Olaf, you get like what, 5,000 a day, or
5,000.
you said you guys, if you want to go into scrolling, then it's unlimited. But it's 5,000.
Oh, I'm saying you can get 5,000 per request.
Okay.
So if you want to get all 70,000 whatever distributions, you can get it in a couple. Well, just depending on how quickly you fetch it, but you can get it all quite quickly. It's just we just have to batch it in 5,000, because what happens is if you give a size, there's a certain amount of memory that gets set aside for this. Even if the size is way greater than the possible count at the end, there's still a certain amount of resources that get set aside for that. So we just want to avoid those kinds of problems.
I got a little confused. I was thinking like 5,000 requests per day that you were throttling at the IP level.
No, there's no throttling that goes on at all. It's just everyone, just do your thing. Just try to keep everything online.
So if we're going to hammer it, just try to do it in the same way.
Yeah, for sure, you can totally hammer it. We don't pay for the hosting, actually, so that's the thing. We don't pay for anything. Everything's sponsored. Occasionally somebody asks if they can donate us money, but we wouldn't really have anything to do with it. So we've actually been quite lucky that way. Is there one more question?
Yeah, sorry, I've had several aborted attempts to try to craft queries where I'm filtering by distributions that have favorites.
Mm-hmm.
So I want all data : distribution with favorites or something like that.
Right.
Is there something about the schema that makes that really, really arcane and difficult?
Well,
I get into it, usually it's about a half an hour, and I'm like, I can't figure it out. And
yeah, I mean, the first problem is that you can't do joins.
yeah.
Now, Moritz Onken, he's put together sort of an experimental join syntax, and I think there is stuff that you can join on favorites, but it's going to give you there's a huge amount of stuff that you get back. I should also mention you can specify the fields that you want back so that you don't just get a huge amount of stuff.
So would the best way be then to search on the favorites table and filter by the name of the distribution?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we can talk about that too.
I've always been going the other way, trying to find the favorites key in the distribution, but it's actually a separate.
Yeah, it's just a separate thing entirely. So just start with the favorites and then do another query. And the one more thing I should say is that when you are doing more complex searches, there are 3 potential statuses that a distribution can have. One is CPAN, which means it's currently on CPAN. One is backpan, which means it's on backpan. And one is latest. And latest means it's currently on CPAN and it's also the latest authorized distribution. So basically, latest is sort of a subset of CPAN. So if you're going to get Moose latest, everything that's on CPAN, like say there's 10 disks of Moose on CPAN right now, only 9 of them will be marked CPAN, 1 will be marked latest. So if you want all 10 of those, you need to actually query or filter on both latest and CPAN. That's because there's also no select distinct or things like that. So we've kind of had to work around that a little bit.
I noticed there's a release and a distribution key for the favorites. Do favorites go with distributions or releases?
Initially, we thought it would be neat to see which actual version you favorited, so we could credit that to the author who released that one, because more than one author could release a different distribution. I don't think it's really been that helpful, so I wouldn't really worry about it. Just
What the number that we see is actually tracking distributions, not releases.
right.
I mean, on the-
But you could, if you wanted to sort of break it down in time and stuff like that, you could do that stuff. So. Okay, so yeah, hit me up if you have any questions in person, and I'm happy to help. And thanks, Ron.